look at the state of this drawer. I need to get it sorted as soon as possible. What's up, woodworkers? Ben here, and after looking at this absolute mess for ages, thinking it was something I could definitely do a better job of, it eventually made its way to the top of my list. So let's get cracking and build a kitchen cutlery drawer organiser. I decided to use up some of the reclaimed hardwood I've got stashed away. I don't know about you, but I found myself stashing all this hardwood away, but then never using it, as I just ended up saving it for the perfect project. So I've recently made the decision that I'm going to use more of it in projects and get the enjoyment from working with a good quality hardwood rather than just saving it for the project that might never happen. I'd previously planed most of the paint off these Sapele stair treads, but still needed to rip the rounded painted edges off, so I set to this first on my new Evolution table saw. I didn't need the pieces to be as thick as this, and I reckon I could resaw this down the middle to get two thinner boards. My table saw blade wouldn't go quite through though in one pass, so I needed to run it through halfway and then flip it over to complete the cut. Unfortunately though, because of this I needed to remove the riving knife to make my first pass. Now, removing the riving knife is never recommended, but if you aren't cutting all the way through the wood, then it's relatively safe to do so and necessary to make the cut. Once I'd done this on two boards, I put the riving knife back on, I flipped the board over and completed the cut on the other side of both of the boards that I'm going to be using. It was then just a case of running them all through the thickness planer, so I had 4 boards all exactly the same thickness, which is around 10mm or 3/8 of an inch. I took this opportunity to give the boards their initial sanding, so I had less work to do with the smaller parts later down the line. Now, as you probably guessed by now, I had no plan or actual idea of how I was going to make this thing, so I thought the best bet would be to lay out the maximum space available with some masking tape on my workbench. Then I laid out my boards for the main frame and plopped all the cutlery in to figure out a layout that would work. I came up with this, where I can add a bunch of dividers. Now I need to make sure I account for the thickness of the wood between each section so that I can get my measurements right. Once I was happy with my layout, I knew how much wood I needed, so I went ahead and ripped my boards to the height I wanted. I could have made this a nice deep drawer, but as I needed to be able to easily access the items inside, I decided to make it relatively shallow. Then it was a case of cutting my long pieces first. In order to get them exactly the same size, I attached them together using masking tape and CA glue. I don't like to rely on having super accurate measurements. I'd rather go with something where I don't need to rely on my useless brain. So where possible, I always try and simply reference the space I'm fitting it to. So this is exactly what I did. I test fit it, then went back to the miter saw and cut a teeny smidge off. Test again. Cut a smidge. Test. And bingo bango, we had a perfect fit. So now I just needed to do the same with the end pieces. So I cut a piece and then used the tape and glue method to hold it to the other piece so that I can cut them down exactly the same length as each other again. Then I did a test fit. It was a touch too snug, so cut another little smidge off, and this time I was happy with it. Okay, now I've got my main frame done, I can lay out my utensils and see what works. The teaspoons were tall enough so that they would essentially take up the width of the knives, forks and larger spoons together, so this layout works quite well. I decided to start out with the easy bits, which were the full depth dividers for the items on the left side. So I cut some more of the strips I used for the frame down on my miter saw. Then I decided to do the long piece to join this last divider to the end piece for the larger utensils. I tell you what, if I'd have engaged my brain at some point doing this, I would either have used my band clamp or even some masking tape to hold this frame together while I fiddled around with all the pieces. I knocked it over so many times, and not once did I try and sort the problem. Talk about making life difficult for yourself. Once I was happy with this long piece, I measured the remaining space for my next divider, which would then connect to this long piece. I cut this and then knocked some more of the frame over because it was just so much fun and I couldn't help myself. It was at this point I decided there was too much space available for what I needed, and I thought I could make another space next to the teaspoons. As long as I made sure that I had enough room for the longest items, which were the knives, on the right, then I could definitely make another section for these other bits. Also, Don't ask why I've got a glue stick in the cutlery drawer, as I have absolutely no idea. I cut another piece to divide this slot, and now it was time to do the dividers between the knives, forks and spoons. Because of the way I've gone about this process, it ultimately didn't matter too much how long these pieces were, as long as they were all the same and they allowed enough room for the knives, which was the longest items I'll be putting in there. I cut these down on the miter saw again, knocked over the pieces, again, and was happy with the layout. However, these smaller sections would be a bit tricky to get fingers in to easily remove the cutlery when you need it, so I had to think about what I could do to make this work. I think a groove or a cutaway would probably be best. I'm definitely going to do these two, and probably this one as well, but I don't think the others need anything. For the cutaway sections, I marked out a distance from each end and then another measurement a bit further in and then down. Then I just joined my marks up to make an angle at each end, joined by a straight line in the middle. I recently did a video on why I sold my bandsaw, and this is one of those rare projects where the bandsaw would have been a bit easier, but as I mentioned in that video, I can do most of the cuts that I used to do on the bandsaw with my jigsaw. This was no exception. I found that with the jigsaw, as long as you go slow and take your time, you can get a reasonable cut with it. But on this occasion, it still needed a bit of tidying up, so I spent some time with a rasp and a file getting it as neat as I could. I'm pretty happy with that. It makes it a lot easier to access the cutlery compared to the full-sized one, so I went ahead and did pretty much the same with the smaller one next to the teaspoons. In order to perfectly replicate the one I did for the knives, and to save me going through the rigmarole of using the jigsaw and files method again, I decided to tape the one I'd already done to the other one and then cut it away using a flush trim templating bit on my router table. I did this in shallow passes until it matched my template exactly. And there we go, a perfect match. A little hand sanding and they're good to go. Okay, so I've got everything cut and shaped how I want it. So I'm going to give it all a light sand. I'm going to just soften over those sharp edges and then it's on to assembly. Now the big question is, how the hell am I going to assemble this thing? I've been thinking about this all the way through this process and I'm really unsure about how to get it all together, considering how many times I've knocked these pieces over just while I've been planning the layout. I think I'm going to do the frame first and then figure out all the other bits after. There seems to be a fairly logical order to me that will make the most sense in most parts, but some of it's just going to be plain tricky. Alright, so I set out my frame with an overly elaborate setup with clamping squares and a band clamp, then used some wood glue on the ends of the short boards to glue it together. Then it was just a case of tightening the band clamp until it was all tight. These band clamps are great, but even with the clamping squares on, it can pull it out of square pretty easily, especially when the boards are so thin. So I checked the diagonal measurements to make sure they match. It was slightly out of square, so I pushed on the corners from the longer measurements to bring it into square until the measurements matched. Then I left it for the glue to dry. Once the glue was dry, I took off all the clamps and then laid it out again for the umpteenth time. Does anyone else do this when they're building something? I swear I spend half my time laying it out to see what it'll look like when it's finished, rather than actually just working on it. Anyway, after knocking all those pieces over so many times, when I was laying it all out, I decided to put a few little spacer pieces to help me keep it all laid out correctly. So these were the pieces I decided to glue next. This was probably the most awkward part, but these spacer pieces made a huge difference. Once I glued and clamped them in place, I decided to fire in a few brad nails. These are all going to be on the outside where you won't see them, so I wasn't worried about seeing the nail heads or anything. Oh, and before you ask, yes, I did remove the spacers as soon as I'd nailed the pieces in, just so they didn't end up stuck to the actual project. This allowed me to keep on working. So I attached the next couple of pieces and fired in brad nails again from the outside edge. Then when I had those pieces in place, I went ahead and attached the longer dividers, which I just measured the spacing out for. I'm not going to lie to you, that was probably one of the most stressful glue-ups I've ever done. I'm going to leave it in the clamps now and hopefully it's going to turn out alright. We'll see. So after a stiff drink and a few hours, I took it out of the clamps and then I ran over it with the sander to smooth down any high spots from where I hadn't quite laid it out properly. I then did a bit of hand sanding to get rid of any excess glue and smooth off the edges. I decided to put a base on it, but before I do that, I'm going to add some mineral oil to it. I wanted something food safe, and I had some of this lying around, so hopefully it does the trick. I did toy with not giving this thing a base at all, but the drawer is in our caravan, and as such you can bump about in transit, so I thought the base would be useful so the cutlery doesn't get caught up underneath the organiser, especially things like knives and that kind of thing. I dug around in my plywood offcuts and found this really thin piece that would do just fine. It was almost the exact width I needed as well, so it would only need trimming down and then cutting to length. So I did this on the miter saw and the table saw. I made sure that I didn't add any oil to the underside of the drawer organiser so that I could glue the base on it, and I decided that CA glue would be easy enough to do this with. It's less likely to squeeze out and dries nice and quickly, and as this thing isn't going to be pulled in or out or have much pressure on it, I figured this would be fine. So after a few minutes I was able to add some more mineral oil to the base. Then all that was left was to install it, and it fitted really nicely. Now if you happen to be interested in any of the tools or anything that I've used in this video, I'll stick a few links in the description along with some discount codes that I've got as well, so be sure to check them out. And if you're interested in checking out another simple project, then you'll want to watch this video next.